Well, South Africa will later this month host the G20 Summit in Johannesburg. The country's collective approach to G20 presidency has been characterized by three key priorities, which include economic growth and financial stability, as well as climate change and environmental sustainability development. The summit comes on the back of tumultuous geopolitical climate and fractured relations with the United States. Now let's explore the usefulness of the G20 and its potential benefits to South Africa and the African continent. We're senior research fellow at the Trade Collective, Dr. Lebohang Pheko, joins us live for this discussion. Dr. Pheko, thank you so much for your time. Some have been arguing whether or not essentially the G20 presidency for South Africa will have any tangible benefits perhaps for the continent, or is it perhaps maybe just symbolic?
So, thank you, Veronica, and thank you to the viewers as well. There are a few different schools of thought. The one is that it lifts our diplomatic visibility, our economic visibility, and it sort of elevates South Africa as a continental leader in the voice on economic issues. There's also the argument that potentially this could signal other commitments on green financing, on debt relief mechanisms, and so forth, and also that it could also signal some investment commitments in the context of project pipelines and so on. But and then when we think about it in the context of the broader Africa region, could this potentially also platform much broader Africa-wide debt relief, debt consolidation, and I would also argue debt cancellation. And therein lies the rub, is that really is the G20 really a progressive fora for African countries? And I think the argument has been that there is so much contestation and competition for very scarce resources or misaligned resources globally, that other matters that are really of more interest to the Africa continent do tend to be deprioritized. And lastly, to add that there are no binding mechanisms in the G20 deliberations. They are entirely discretionary. The chairperson makes a series of recommendations which may or may not be followed. So I think that there are many reasons that we have to be skeptical about whether the G20, beyond its symbolic importance, is of really substantive transformational value to South Africa and the broader African continent.
And often we know that the G20 is dominated by the global north and often sidelines developing countries. How can we ensure that South Africa will make sure that the African continent's issues are heard and acted on?
I'm not sure whether we can, Veronica. This is because of the construction of the G20. So remember that the G20 primarily is a few European countries, Saudi Arabia, plus the European Union itself as a member, and plus South Africa, and one or two others which are seen to be emerging or important geopolitical economies such as our own. Always the argument about why us and not, say Egypt or Nigeria, which perhaps is a debate for another day. But I think in the midst of that, one would also argue that certainly then it means, I don't know whether we have the leverage per se. One thing I think that we should take some comfort and I think some inspiration from is from our predecessors in Brazil, who had a much more explicit developmental and slightly more transformative agenda that they set aside. And this really was more to do with social redistribution, with poverty reduction, poverty eradication, in fact. And I think it's unfortunate that we haven't quite picked up that agenda. It's slightly watered down. So I think that what we need to do is to be much more explicit in the deliberations, but certainly we also need a chair, in the chairing of the recommendations and in the framing of the recommendations to be extremely, I think, much more rigorous in what our demands are, much more forward-looking and forward-thinking. However, I'm not sure whether, given our performance and even what we have derived from other similar formations, for example, the BRICS and IPSA before that, whether we have the capacity or the political interest in trying to really leverage our own power and our own voice to the extent that we are able to really see ourselves as equal role players at the table and not just some cameo guests who are incredibly grateful for whatever reason to be there, despite our immense resources and despite amplify our immense geopolitical influence.
And I want to talk about the geopolitical climate in itself. This G20 is happening at a time where the world faces growing inequality. There is wars as well as the climate crisis. What strategies can South Africa push at the G20 to tackle these type of issues, but specifically for Africa?
I mean, I think there are a few concrete asks that we can consider, Veronica. One would be certainly debt relief, or I would argue debt cancellation demands. The other would be much quicker IMF governance reform and reconstruction, restructuring. We also need to think around real-scale, real-time climate financing, and also much more predictable concessional finances. And one way to do this is to build coalitions with other African countries, build coalitions with our BRICS allies, because we really need to be leveraging those relationships much more strongly, build relationships with other South-South majority world partners as well, to really present a bloc and unified positions on these key positions. And I think we can also follow up using the problematic as they may be, IMF, World Bank. I think the Bretton Woods institutions lack legitimacy. They are toxic institutions, but be that as it may, that is the architecture that is at the disposal of heads of state, heads of government, and the members of the G20 to follow up on some of these reform timelines, some of the obligations, and also to see if there are any announced projects and pipelines that can be made to the summit. Because I think the other thing that's important is that we can't just keep talking and running. There has to be something that has some tangible value long after these events. Otherwise, these become fancy events management occasions rather than things that really have any tangible value in our economies. And remember, it costs us money to run and to host these events. We must be able to at least leverage something palpable out of them.
And certainly that was actually going to be my next question. What would success in terms of the G20 presidency for South Africa actually look like? How will ordinary South Africans feel the impact?
I'm not sure if they will, Veronica, in the immediate term, but I think success could potentially look like debt justice, as I've mentioned. I'm very keen that we really rethink and reframe the whole debt, the debt cancellation, debt reform conversation, because many countries and many thinkers are really in the realm of talking about debt cancellation and really reframing the idea that as African countries and countries of the majority world, we owe, when in fact the world owes us. What is extracted in illicit financial flows, what is extracted in double taxation and double invoicing, what has been extracted keeps on being extracted in our underpriced resources, raw materials that is taking off of the continent, and of course our human resources. So I think the debt justice piece is very important. A whole governance reform or governance realignment, rethinking is really important. And also I think a set of social protection commitments, especially at a time when there is so much precarity in labor markets, in commodities markets, where we are seeing a time where, companies are able to lay off, the numbers of retrenchments and dismissals is quite high. At this time of great precarity and great uncertainty, we need to really set aside resources for social protections and social safety nets, because we can see that it's clear that many people are falling out of the employment matrix, and there have to be ways to catch them and to reinstitute the social contract between state and people.
Absolutely. Well, Professor, thank you. Well, Dr. Pheko, thank you so much for your time and your insight into the realities of what the G20 presidency looks like for South Africa, of course, ahead of that big summit. That was Senior Research Fellow at the Trade Collective, Dr. Lebohang Pheko, speaking to us about that. Of course, more news and views on the other side of this.